I was the mother who gave everything to her son. Until the day he locked me in the attic, musty, leaking, and forgotten. Below me, he and his wife whispered about stealing everything I owned and throwing me in a care home. But what they didn't know, I heard everything, and I was already planning my return. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe to catch our most haunting stories yet. The spring wind slid across the still water of Maple Lake, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet soil. The trees rustled gently a hush over the landscape like a secret shared between the branches. Sitting on a weather-worn bench by the dock, Margaret Lane 72 folded her hands in her lap and stared at the house behind her, the only home she'd ever truly known. Peeling sky-blue paint clung to old clapboards like fragile skin. The lake house had stood for more than 40 years, a quiet witness to birthdays, anniversaries, arguments, reconciliations, and finally, silence. After her husband Robert died, silence became the loudest sound Margaret knew. Even the wind brushing past the shutters sometimes made her flinch. Her coat was too thin for the weather, but she didn't move. She wasn't cold. Not anymore. It was her last morning here. After the mild stroke 2 months ago, Margaret could no longer pretend. Her balance had gone. Her right hand trembled when she buttoned her blouse. The doctors warned of the next one and what it might take from her. Her world had become smaller. Each step down the porch stairs felt steeper. Loneliness pressed harder. And then after months of unanswered holiday cards and years of being an afterthought, her son Daniel Lane finally called. "Mom," he said, voice clipped, distracted. "Why don't you move in with us? It'll be easier. You shouldn't be alone out there anymore." Margaret didn't ask why now. Didn't ask what changed. She only said, if you're sure Daniel and heard his silence say more than his words ever could. He didn't come to help her pack. Didn't offer to drive. He paid for a moving service and sent instructions through his wife Olivia, who texted 3 times with emoji-laced enthusiasm and links to stair lifts for future reference. And now it was done. The house was sold. The truck was packed. What hadn't been sold or given away fit neatly into 2 suitcases and 1 trunk, a heavy, scarred wooden chest she hadn't opened in years. Inside were fragments of a life, Robert's letters from Vietnam, the deed to the lake house, a faded birth certificate, a certificate of investment from a tech company her husband had once insisted on buying just in case Daniel ever needs college money. She kept it all not because she thought it would matter, but because memories unlike people didn't abandon you. Now she stood. Her knees cracked like dry branches, and she winced, placing a hand on the armrest. Turning one last time to look at the house, she saw not its decay, but all it had held. Daniel's muddy footprints on the floor after fishing. Robert dancing with her in the kitchen to Nat King Cole. The late nights with a crying infant pressed to her shoulder. Every smile, every silence. "Goodbye," she whispered. No one heard. The car ride to Asheville was long and uneventful. The driver was a college kid named Lucas, polite enough to help load her bags but glued to his earbuds the rest of the way. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred silence to shallow noise. Asheville came into view as the trees gave way to rows of beige condominiums and neatly trimmed hedges. The suburban perfection was eerie, like a set, like a place where no one had ever cried. The car turned into Eaglebrook Heights, a gated community where every house looked cloned from the next. Identical driveways, identical porch lights, identical lives. Lucas pulled up to the curb. "This it?" he asked, pulling a single bud from his ear. Margaret looked up at the 2-story house. Brick facade, perfectly manicured lawn, and a black mailbox that gleamed like a showroom prop. Her chest tightened. "This is it," she said. The door opened before she knocked. Olivia stepped out glowing as always, her blonde hair pulled into a slick bun and a glass of green juice in hand. She wore a fitted lilac blazer, crisp white trousers, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Margaret!" she exclaimed, air-kissing both cheeks. "Oh my God, you look great. Did you lose weight? Come in, come in. Daniel's in a meeting, but he'll be down soon." Margaret smiled politely and allowed herself to be ushered in. The floor beneath her was polished wood slick and spotless. Not a speck of dust, not a family photo in sight. The walls were adorned with modern abstract prints and scented candles in geometric holders. It smelled like lavender and money. "You must be exhausted," Olivia chirped. "Let me show you to your room. We've set up a lovely space for you. Temporarily, of course, until the guest room is renovated." Margaret blinked. Renovated? "Yeah, it's well, you'll see." She followed Olivia up a narrow staircase. The second floor was silent doors shut tight. Olivia didn't stop. Instead, she opened a smaller stairwell tucked behind a hallway door. It was steeper, dustier, hotter. The attic. Margaret hesitated. "We tried to make it cozy," Olivia said quickly, catching the pause. "You know, like a retreat space, a bit boho chic, private." The door creaked open. Inside the attic was dimly lit by a single window no bigger than a car license plate. A narrow twin bed sat beneath the sloped ceiling. A rickety nightstand held a lamp with a crooked shade. The air smelled of insulation and age. The fan in the corner was unplugged. There was no closet, just a metal rack bolted into the wall. "This is fine," Margaret said quietly. "It's temporary," Olivia repeated, setting her suitcase down by the bed. "Daniel's office is in the second bedroom, and mine's technically the guest room, but with my clients on video calls all day, you know it's just not practical." Margaret nodded. She understood more than she let on. "I'll let you settle in. Dinner's at 6. "Daniel's grilling salmon," Olivia called over her shoulder as she disappeared down the steps. "Text me if you need anything." Margaret stood still for a long moment. Then slowly she sat on the edge of the bed. It sagged under her weight. The mattress was hard. The room was sweltering. She opened her trunk and stared at the past tucked inside letters, documents, Robert's watch. In the silence, she could hear muffled voices from below. Laughter, not hers. She reached for a framed photo tucked in the trunk's corner, Robert smiling in his Sunday suit, his eyes kind. She placed it on the nightstand and exhaled. This wasn't what she imagined. This wasn't the homecoming she hoped for. But Margaret Lane had been underestimated before, and something inside her, quiet but fierce, had begun to wake. The second morning in the attic began with a soft knock on the trapdoor, and the scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifting upward like bait. Margaret Olivia's voice floated up like a song rehearsed one too many times. "I made cinnamon French toast. Come down when you're ready, all right." Margaret had been awake for 2 hours already. The fan had done little to battle the heat trapped in the slanted ceiling overnight. Her cotton nightgown clung to her skin with damp insistence, and her joints ached from the unyielding mattress. She ran a comb through her graying hair, gathered it into a neat twist, and stared at her reflection in the tiny attic mirror nailed to the far wall. The woman staring back looked older than 72, or maybe just lonelier. By the time she descended the stairs, slowly, carefully clutching the banister with her still shaky hand, the house was alive with the scent of butter and coffee, the sound of soft jazz playing from a smart speaker tucked behind a decorative orchid. Olivia sat at the kitchen island, flawless as always. Hair up, lipstick, coral silk robe tied perfectly at her waist. She smiled as Margaret entered. "There she is," Olivia said, sliding a plate across the counter. "Sleep well." Margaret offered a polite nod. The fan helped. "Thank you." Olivia leaned casually against the marble counter. "So, any thoughts on what you'll do with the money from the lake house?" Margaret's fork paused midair. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "The house," Olivia repeated casually, swirling her coffee. "I mean, it must have gone for a pretty decent sum with that lakefront view, right? You always said it wasn't much, but with how the market is now, you must be sitting on a nice little nest egg." Margaret smiled faintly. "I haven't decided yet." Sure. "Of course," Olivia replied quickly. "Just curious. We're all family now, right?" There was something about the way she said it, light, airy, but too precise. Margaret noticed how Olivia didn't ask whether she needed help managing it. She asked how much it was and what she planned to do with it. The kitchen felt colder than it had a moment ago, despite the warmth of the toast. Later that day, Margaret returned to the attic and opened the old trunk again. She sat beside it on the floor, her legs folded painfully beneath her, and sifted through the contents, as if searching for reassurance. Her hand lingered on the yellowed envelope that held the stock certificates from decades past, an investment Robert had insisted on back when their bank account rarely saw 3 figures. "It'll pay off one day, Maggie," he'd said, grinning like a man with a secret. "Maybe not for us, but maybe for Daniel." Daniel, now 43, a senior project manager at a mid-tier construction firm, working more hours than he ever admitted. And yet she hadn't seen him in 2 days. He left early, came home late. Margaret only caught glimpses of him through the stair railing, sometimes on his phone, other times laughing softly over a whiskey glass. He hadn't asked how she was settling in. He hadn't asked about the lake house. He hadn't asked anything at all. That evening she came down for dinner. The table was set for 3, but only 2 plates had been arranged. Olivia served grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a quinoa salad from a plastic container. Daniel never appeared. "Working late again," Olivia said, waving a hand. "This project is eating him alive." Margaret chewed slowly. She found herself unsure of what to say. Every word felt like it echoed in a cavern where none were returned. "I'm sorry about the attic," Olivia said between sips of kombucha. "It's not exactly ideal, I know. But you've got your own space, and you can come and go as you please." "It's fine," Margaret replied again, her default answer for every discomfort since arriving. Olivia cut into her chicken with a bit more force than necessary. "So, Margaret," she said lightly, "have you thought about drafting a will? I mean, just, to be safe. God forbid anything ever happens." Margaret's fork clinked against her plate. "A will. I mean, don't get me wrong," Olivia added quickly, almost too quickly. "You're still young and you look fantastic. But these things are best handled before they become urgent, right?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "I've had one for a while now," she said softly. "It's with my lawyer." Olivia smiled. "Smart. It's always better to be prepared. And I'm sure Daniel's in it, right?" Margaret didn't answer. The silence lasted 2 beats too long. That night, lying awake in the attic with the fan humming above her and the heat clinging like guilt, Margaret began to feel it, something faint and slow, like a drop of oil spreading in clear water. Distrust. She hadn't felt it right away. She had wanted to believe in kindness, in family, in Daniel's quiet love. But love didn't forget birthdays. Love didn't send you a ride share instead of a ride. Love didn't put you in an attic. And love didn't ask about money before asking how you'd slept. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the wooden trunk. What if it wasn't just curiosity? What if Olivia's interest wasn't maternal but financial? She remembered a detail, a tiny offhand moment. Yesterday, after she'd stepped into the bathroom, she'd returned to find the attic door ajar. Her trunk had been shifted. The scarf she wrapped around the stock certificates had been unfolded, poorly rewrapped. Had Olivia come up here? That next morning, Margaret tested her theory. She folded an old newspaper and wedged it carefully between the lid and the base of the trunk, just out of sight. If anyone opened it, the newspaper would slip. She closed the trunk, covered it with a folded quilt, and left the attic to walk to the local park. The house was quiet. Daniel, as usual, was gone. Olivia was in her office taking a call with someone named Lindsay and using words like visibility and engagement rate. Margaret returned 2 hours later. The newspaper was on the floor. She stood there holding the evidence in her hand, and something inside her went cold. That night at dinner, Daniel joined them. He barely looked up from his phone. Margaret tried to make conversation, asked about his work, his colleagues, his stress. He answered in monosyllables. Olivia filled in the blanks with cheery commentary. But Margaret was watching now, seeing details she hadn't noticed before, the way Olivia's eyes flicked toward Daniel every time Margaret spoke, as if gauging his reaction. The way Daniel kept glancing at the attic stairs when he thought she wasn't looking. Later after dinner, Olivia came up with a tray of tea. "Chamomile," she said brightly, "helps with sleep." Margaret took it with a nod but didn't sip. She waited until Olivia left, then she poured it slowly into the bathroom sink. She didn't think it was poisoned. She didn't think they were monsters. But she did think they were preparing something, setting the stage, grooming her. Margaret stared at herself in the mirror, then turned back to the trunk. She opened it. Carefully, she removed the stock certificates. She took out the deeds. She lifted the old jewelry box Robert had given her in 1976. She stared at the small faded photo of Daniel at age 7, cheeks round, eyes bright before time hardened him into the man who now sat silently across from her at dinner. One by one she tucked those things into a smaller bag and slid it under her mattress. And then she waited. Because now Margaret Lane no longer doubted. And whatever Olivia and Daniel thought they were planning, they had underestimated the woman in the attic. It happened on a Wednesday night, one of those nights where sleep drifted just out of reach, teasing the edges of Margaret Lane's tired eyes. The attic was hotter than usual. A storm had passed through earlier, leaving the roof soaked and the insulation bloated with moisture. The fan clicked helplessly in the corner, spinning more out of duty than purpose. Margaret had gotten used to the silence of this space, but that night silence wasn't what kept her awake. It was unease, a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck like being watched or worse calculated. She slipped out of bed, her thin cotton robe swishing against her legs, and padded carefully down the attic stairs. Her joints cracked in protest, but she didn't stop. She needed water, or maybe just air. The house below was still, lights off except for the faint glow seeping from under the kitchen door. Olivia and Daniel must still be awake. Margaret paused at the landing, one foot hovering above the floorboard she knew would squeak. She waited, breathing shallowly. And then she heard them. Their voices were low, but the acoustics of the open-plan staircase carried them upward clear enough to shatter whatever illusions remained. "She's getting slower," Olivia said. Her voice clipped. "Barely made it down the stairs this morning. You saw that, didn't you?" "I did," Daniel replied. "She's slipping." There was the clink of glass, perhaps wine. "We have to do this before she goes completely," Olivia continued. "Once her memory's gone, it'll be a legal mess." "I know," Daniel muttered. "She trusts you. You're her only son. If we're going to transfer the assets, it needs to be soon. The lake house money, the bonds, whatever else she's hiding." There was a pause. Daniel sighed. "She hasn't told me the exact amount, just that she's got enough to live on, which means it's more than she wants to admit." "Come on, Daniel. She's sitting on a pile of money and we're drowning in credit card debt." Another pause. "And after the transfer," Daniel asked. Margaret could practically hear Olivia's shrug. "I've been looking into facilities. There's a place in Fairmont, private rooms, nice staff. They even let you bring your own furniture." "She won't agree to that." "She won't have to." Silence. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She felt as if her entire chest had gone hollow like a bird cage with no heartbeat inside. "She's old, Daniel. She won't last much longer, and we need that money now, not when it's buried with her." Margaret took a step back. Her heel brushed the wall and she froze. The voices below paused for a heartbeat, but then resumed softer now, as though sensing the air had changed. She crept back up the attic stairs in complete darkness, her breath locked inside her chest like a secret too heavy to carry. Once inside her room, she closed the door quietly and turned the lock. Her hands were shaking, but not from age, from betrayal. She crossed the attic floor with slow mechanical movements and knelt in front of the trunk. This time she opened it not for nostalgia, but for clarity. She pulled out the photo, the one she always kept wrapped in an embroidered cloth from Saigon, decades old, but still scented faintly with sandalwood. Robert looked back at her from behind the glass, standing in front of their first car in 1973. Tie-crooked smile, soft and unguarded. "You wouldn't believe what's become of him," she whispered. Her voice cracked around the edges. "I raised him to be better than this." She pressed her fingers to the photo, then set it on the floor and reached deeper into the trunk. The stock certificates were still there. The deed from the lake house sale. A printed summary from her online bank account, over $220,000. The careful savings of a woman who had counted every cent and bought nothing for herself in the past 20 years. And they wanted it, not to help her, not to ensure her comfort, but to bury her with a smile and get the check while the ink was still wet. Tears rose, but they didn't fall. Her throat closed around the sound of them, holding them back like something sacred. She wouldn't cry in their house, not now. Instead, she did something else. She reached for the smallest pouch in the trunk, leather-bound, zippered tight, and unwrapped its contents. A USB drive, copies of her documents, a separate emergency bank card in her maiden name, and the contact information for Robert's old friend Walter Gibbons, a retired attorney who had sent her a Christmas card every year without fail, even after Robert's death. She hadn't called Walter in years, but she would now. She folded the documents into a folder and zipped them into the lining of her suitcase. Then she opened her notebook and began to write not a journal entry, not a letter, but a list. A list of what was hers. A list of what they wouldn't take. Downstairs, laughter erupted from the living room. Daniel and Olivia were watching a late-night comedy, their voices loud and bright, so at odds with what they'd said just minutes earlier, that Margaret felt like she was standing in a parallel world. She moved to the small attic window and slid it open, letting the cool night air brush against her skin. Asheville glowed in the distance. White porch lights, red tail lights, yellow lamps glowing in identical bedrooms where children were being kissed goodnight and mothers were being tucked in with blankets and love. Not here, not in this house. In this house she was a transaction waiting to be processed. She looked at Robert's photo again. "They're going to try to move me out," she whispered. "They want me gone. They think they can dress it in care and call it love. But I see them now." She sat in silence until the laughter faded below and the smart speaker turned off. She waited until the lights clicked out one by one. The only sound left was the occasional shift of the house settling on its foundation, and then she climbed into bed still fully clothed and stared at the ceiling as the fan made its endless circles above her. This time she didn't dream. She planned. The morning after the overheard conversation, Margaret Lane awoke before dawn. Not because of the heat, not because of the aching in her knees or the stale air trapped beneath the attic roof. She awoke because her instincts had. Something had shifted inside her, some primal part that had long gone dormant. The part that once carried a child through 3 days of labor without medication. The part that cleaned motel bathrooms at age 40 to pay for her son's braces. The part that stayed silent when life demanded strength and rose when silence was no longer enough. She sat up slowly, reached for the notebook under her pillow, and opened to the page she'd titled the night before, "What They Don't Know." At the top of the list she underlined 3 words: document, protect, prepare. Margaret had no illusions of drama. She didn't believe in confrontations that solved things with tears and redemption. Life was never that cinematic. No, what she believed in was leverage, quiet, unshakable leverage. And so it began. Later that morning, while Olivia was out on her mid-morning Pilates class and Daniel was tucked away in his glass box home office on Zoom, Margaret wandered downstairs with a gentle pace and quiet purpose. She carried with her a small, outdated cell phone, the kind that slid open, the kind she kept hidden inside a sewing kit. No one ever bothered to touch. No apps, no tracking, no cloud. She placed it in her cardigan pocket and walked into the kitchen. Daniel's voice echoed from the office. "If we can shift the foundation order by Q3, then maybe." She opened the fridge. Milk, eggs, green juice, something in a bottle labeled collagen booster. She closed it, then opened a cabinet with a slow, deliberate creak. "What are you looking for?" Daniel's voice called out suddenly. Margaret didn't flinch. "Tea," she replied. There was a pause. "You usually drink the one upstairs." "I wanted something different," she said without turning. He didn't press. But she heard the hesitation, heard him wondering if she'd overheard last night, heard the pause that only guilt brings. She kept her face passive and moved on. In the attic that night, she placed the small phone on her nightstand and waited. She didn't have to wait long. The argument began at 10:47 p.m. The door to the master bedroom opened. Footsteps descended the stairs. Voices lowered, but not enough. Margaret pressed record. "You were supposed to bring it up today," Olivia hissed. "You said you'd talk to her about consolidating the finances." "I couldn't, okay." She looked different, like she knows something. "Of course she knows something. She's not an idiot, Daniel." "Lower your voice. I'm serious. If we wait too long, we'll lose our chance. I'm telling you, she's hiding money. That trunk of hers, it's got more than family photos." There was a thud. Maybe a glass on a table, maybe a heartbeat landing on hardwood. Daniel muttered, "I'll talk to her tomorrow." "You said that yesterday." The recording ran 10 minutes. Margaret let it continue, then saved it. then backed it up to the second phone she kept in her pillowcase, burner phone number 2. By the next day she had 3 recordings, none overt, none sensational, but all damning in their own subtle, calculated way. On Thursday morning she waited until the house emptied. Daniel left at 7:00 a.m. sharp. Olivia followed at 8:15 in her pearl-white SUV with tinted windows and a Starbucks mobile order already queued up. Margaret checked the Nest security app Olivia had installed it months ago, assuming Margaret didn't know the password. But she'd guessed it on the first try, Olivia 123. She disabled the camera in the kitchen for firmware testing. Then she made the call. The number was old, yellowed ink in an address book older than Daniel. Walter Gibbons, Esquire, retired, former probate attorney, widowed, still sent her a birthday card every April. Margaret Lane, he answered after the first ring, his voice gravel and morning bourbon. Walter, it's me. I need your help. Tell me where and when. They met at a park bench downtown under the guise of old friends feeding pigeons. Walter brought breadcrumbs and a briefcase. Margaret brought a flash drive and 20 years of quiet suspicion. When she showed him the recordings, his lips thinned. They're not stupid, she said, watching the birds hop beneath her feet. They're careful, calculated, but not careful enough. Walter exhaled through his nose. You've got enough here to scare them, he said. Enough to draw a line, not enough to stop them. He nodded slowly. Then let's start with leverage. She gave him the details, the assets, the accounts, the house sale, the tech stock. Robert had bought on a whim, in 1998, Belmora Energy Solutions, back when no one thought clean energy would be anything more than a dream. It was pennies back then, she said now. Walter pulled up the valuation from his iPad. Margaret, he said, turning the screen to her, it's worth over $850,000. She didn't speak, didn't blink. Liquid, she asked instead. Easily. And if we move it out of joint access? It was never joint. He looked at her. Then you're in better shape than you thought. Back in the attic, Margaret sat at the edge of the bed with her hands trembling, not from age this time, but from adrenaline, from the stark realization that everything Olivia and Daniel were scheming for, they didn't even know the half of it. They thought they were circling a modest estate. They didn't realize they were dealing with a woman holding the deed to a silent fortune. She stared at the papers Walter had prepared for her. A revised will, a formal revocation of power of attorney, a trust document redirecting all funds, liquid and otherwise, into a protected fund, with no access granted to anyone without her written consent. And the final clause, if anything were to happen to her, accidental or otherwise, all assets would go directly to a charity for elderly care and domestic abuse survivors. Walter had raised an eyebrow at that. You're not leaving it to Daniel. No, she said simply. I already gave him everything that mattered. He gave it back. That evening, Olivia brought her a bowl of mushroom risotto, lukewarm and clearly microwaved. How was your day? She asked too casually. Quiet, Margaret replied. I made a few calls, caught up with some old friends. Olivia smiled tight. That's nice. Margaret ate slowly, pretending not to see the way Olivia watched her. Tomorrow she'd visit the bank and move the assets. Tomorrow she'd schedule a car to view an independent senior residence she'd found online. Tomorrow she'd take the next step in a plan that had no room for guilt, because Margaret Lane had been many things in her life. A wife, a mother, a woman who made do with less and gave more than she received. But tonight, for the first time, she was something else entirely. She was ready, and the war had already begun. Quiet, strategic, inevitable. It was a Thursday morning like any other, at least it was supposed to be. The sun rose lazily over Asheville, spilling soft gold through the kitchen windows of the Lane household. The scent of coffee drifted in the air, a familiar rhythm, Daniel mumbling half awake as he slipped on his tie, Olivia tapping through her emails while sipping green juice she never finished. But upstairs in the attic, silence, unusual silence. By 8:17 a.m., Olivia glanced at the ceiling with a frown. She's usually downstairs by now. Daniel didn't look up. Maybe she's sleeping in. Olivia set her mug down a little harder than necessary. She never sleeps in. At 8:29, Olivia knocked on the attic door. Margaret. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She pushed open the door, annoyed, expecting to find the old woman still curled under that hideous quilt she refused to replace. But the room was empty. Bed made. Pillow fluffed. No suitcase. No trunk. Gone. She blinked. For a second she thought maybe Margaret had gone for a walk, but her cane was still here, her cardigan. Even her phone, the flip model she always carried, sat untouched on the dresser. Daniel, Olivia called this time with an edge in her voice. "Come up here." He appeared moments later, his shirt only half-buttoned, annoyance already creasing his brow. "What?" "She's gone." Daniel paused at the threshold, eyes sweeping the space. His fingers twitched as he moved toward the trunk, no longer tucked beside the bed. He knelt down, looked under the frame, then turned to the closet. Empty. Did she leave a note?" Olivia asked. Daniel didn't answer. He went to the small cabinet near the window, yanked it open, then ripped the drawers from the nightstand, checking for what? A clue. A trail. Nothing. "She couldn't have gone far," Olivia said, her voice rising. "She doesn't drive. She barely walks." Daniel stormed down the stairs, grabbed his phone, and checked the security app. "Disabled at 6:41 a.m., he muttered. Camera offline. Olivia's face paled. "She's smarter than we thought." Daniel didn't respond. His fingers flew across the screen, calling her phone. It rang once from the attic above. They both looked up. She hadn't even taken the phone. Not long after the police arrived. Standard missing persons procedure. They interviewed both Daniel and Olivia, separately asked about Margaret's state of mind, medical conditions, last known location. Olivia insisted that Margaret had seemed confused lately. She forgot the day of the week. Just last Tuesday she offered, wringing her hands. She may have wandered off. Daniel was less convincing. "She was fine," he said. "Lucid. Maybe a little quiet lately, but that's just her." "Any sign she was planning to leave?" one of the officers asked. Daniel hesitated. She did pack some things, I guess, but we didn't notice until this morning." "Did she have any financial concerns? Any conflicts with you or your wife?" Daniel bristled. "Of course not. We were helping her." The officer didn't blink. "We'll issue a bulletin, but if she left on her own accord and isn't in danger, we can't treat it as a criminal case." They filed the report, but they both knew Margaret hadn't wandered off. She'd escaped. That night Daniel tore the house apart. Drawers, cabinets, the safe in his office, all examined. He stormed into Olivia's office, yanked open the filing cabinet. "Her financial statements." "They're gone," he said. "Everything. She took every legal document." Olivia sank into a chair. "You think she found out?" Daniel stared at her, jaw clenched. "I think she always knew." They sat in silence, the weight of it pressing in from every wall. "Where could she have gone?" Olivia asked, finally, voice smaller now. Daniel didn't answer. He had no idea, and that terrified him. 2 months passed. No word, no update, no trace. It was like Margaret Lane had vanished from the face of the earth. Then on a Tuesday morning in July, a cream-colored envelope arrived by certified mail. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Daniel Lane, Olivia Lane, Eaglebrook Heights, Asheville, Ny. Olivia stared at it as if it might explode. Daniel tore it open. Inside was a glossy, professionally printed invitation. Embossed gold lettering on a soft ivory card. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of the Golden Hearth Senior Living Center. Co-founder and executive sponsor Margaret Lane. Saturday, July 22nd at 11:00 a.m. Fairfield Park District, Building C." Olivia's breath hitched. Co-founder. But Daniel's eyes didn't leave the card. His fingers flipped it over. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, calm looping measured, was a short message. "I'm not a burden. I am a light for those the world forgot. Mom." Olivia sank into the chair, speechless. Daniel dropped the card onto the table as if it burned. "She's alive," he said. "No," Olivia whispered. "She's thriving." The camera cuts to Margaret standing tall in front of a freshly painted sign at the Golden Hearth. Her hair pinned back neatly, her navy blazer crisp, the ribbon scissors gleaming in her hands. She smiles for the camera, surrounded by a semicircle of seniors, volunteers, and community leaders. No attic, no dust, no begging for space. Just dignity, freedom, and the life she rebuilt without them. The sunlight streamed through the high windows of the Golden Hearth, warming the hardwood floors and pale yellow walls with a soft, forgiving glow. The center bustled quietly, not with the cold routine of a care facility, but with the tender rhythm of something alive, something reborn. In the middle of it all stood Margaret Lane. Gone were the paper-thin robes and dim attic light. In their place, slacks pressed at the crease, a blouse the color of sky, a scarf tied neatly around her neck, and a voice that carried not with volume but with certainty. Her cane tapped gently on the tile as she walked the hallway, pausing here and there to speak to someone by name. Mrs. Ortega, who loved Spanish lullabies. Mr. Green, a retired librarian who still quoted Dickens when he got nervous. "Let's take our seats for letter writing this morning," Margaret said with a smile. "The children are expecting replies by Friday." In the common room, a dozen senior residents gathered around wide circular tables. Each had stationery in front of them, floral patterns, scented envelopes, pens with blue ink that didn't bleed. On the far wall, a corkboard overflowed with hand-drawn cards, crayon rainbows, stick figures labeled Grandma, glitter-streaked letters that read, "Thank you." These were from the kids. Margaret had built this bridge. Every Saturday, a group of children from St. Vincent's Orphanage visited the Golden Hearth. At first, it was part of a service initiative. Then it became something more, something no one wanted to miss. The children brought noise, chaos, life. The residents gave stories warmth, memory. And Margaret, she gave purpose. She moved among the tables, helping a trembling hand steady a pen, reading aloud the crooked letters of a child's question. "What did you want to be when you were little?" Mrs. Ortega beamed. "A singer," she told the room, "but I had 11 brothers. I learned to cook instead." Laughter. Laughter that didn't apologize for the wrinkles it deepened. Laughter that felt like breath returning to lungs long collapsed. Across the room, a young girl, maybe 9, sat in Margaret's lap, carefully drawing a rose on the corner of her envelope. "You're good at that," Margaret said gently. "My mom taught me," the girl replied. Before she got sick, Margaret's hand found the child's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Then she taught you something beautiful." Later that day, Margaret stood at the front of the activity hall watching as the residents shared their stories, some through drawings, some through music, one even through a puppet show. The orphanage kids sat cross-legged on mats, mesmerized. She watched them all, the broken, the discarded, the forgotten, and felt no sorrow, only purpose, only power. Because here in this sun-drenched sanctuary, built with the very money her son had coveted, she had created something no inheritance could touch. A legacy that didn't whisper, "I endured," but declared, "I rose." The first reporter came on a quiet Wednesday, armed with a notepad and a skeptical smile. "I heard a story," she said to Margaret in the courtyard, "about a woman who used her retirement fund to build a senior center. But what really caught my eye," she flipped open her notebook, "was the headline on the blog that mentioned you, elderly mother turns betrayal into blessing." Margaret didn't flinch, didn't smile. She sipped her tea and met the reporter's gaze evenly. "I don't see myself as betrayed," she said. "I see myself as redirected." The article went viral. Within days, local news stations were asking for interviews. Donations began arriving: $20 from a retired bus driver, $5,000 from a grieving daughter in Portland. Notes scrawled in the margins of checks: "For the mother mine never was. For the version of me I hope to be. For the woman who reminded me it's never too late." Margaret never mentioned Daniel, never named him, but the world read between the lines. They saw the way she stood unbent, the way she honored those who'd been warehoused, dismissed, and silenced. They saw that she had taken the attic, the insult, the exile, and turned it into a foundation brick. She began receiving letters. One from a woman in Oklahoma whose children had left her at a motel with nothing but a suitcase and a Medicaid card. One from a man in Georgia whose father died alone in a nursing home because he was too much work. One from a high schooler in Montana who said simply, "You make me want to grow up." That night, Margaret sat in her new office, a simple room with a mahogany desk, a lamp shaped like a sunflower, and the trunk. Yes, the trunk had come with her. It now sat beneath a window that overlooked the center's courtyard, where wind chimes danced and roses bloomed. She opened it not to hide, but to remember. The photo of Robert was still there. She placed it upright on her desk. "He wouldn't believe this," she murmured. Then again, maybe he would. She pulled out the last printed copy of the trust, the documents Walter had helped her finalize. With a pen, she wrote a final clause, unofficial but important. "If anything happens to me, this center will never close. It belongs to them now, to those who thought their stories were over. To those who gave everything and were left with nothing. Let this be the chapter no one saw coming. She folded the paper, slid it back inside the folder, and locked the drawer. Then she turned out the light and left the office, just another woman walking through the halls of a home she built from heartbreak. But to the others, to the ones watching, remembering, believing, she was no longer just someone's mother. She was someone's miracle. The knock came just before lunch, sharp, insistent, unapologetically loud. Margaret Lane was in the garden courtyard, trimming a row of coral hibiscus by hand, when one of the staff came jogging toward her. "Ms. Lane," she said, slightly breathless. "There's a man at the front desk. Says he's your son." Margaret didn't flinch. She stood slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Tell him I'll see him in the sunroom. Give me 3 minutes." He was already pacing when she arrived. Daniel Lane, 43. Red-eyed jaw clenched, his suit wrinkled at the collar. Anger radiated off him in waves, hot and impatient. He didn't bother to sit. "This is what you've been doing," he snapped. "All this time dodging calls, going ghost. You had us thinking you were dead." Margaret stood across from him, serene, a calm eye in the center of a storm that had long passed. "I left a card," she said quietly. "You received it." Daniel held up the envelope, crumpled and torn. This was your version of a goodbye." Margaret didn't blink. "You never said you were walking away. You never gave me a chance to explain." "You explained quite a bit," she replied. "You just didn't know I was listening." Daniel froze. "And then, Mom, listen. That wasn't what you think." She raised her hand, slow, firm. "Don't call me that. Not right now." His mouth opened, then closed, his fingers clenched into fists. "I'm your son." "That's biology," she said, "not loyalty." He stepped closer, voice rising. "You had no right to take that money and disappear. That house was part of my future. You knew I was counting on that inheritance." "Exactly," she said. "You were counting on my death." The words landed like a slap. Daniel staggered back, momentarily speechless. "I built this center with what was mine," she continued. "Money earned, saved, protected. Not stolen, not manipulated, not begged from a woman you shoved into an attic. I didn't shove you. You watched her do it and said nothing. That's the same thing." The silence stretched. From the hallway, a few residents had stopped. A staff member paused behind a cart. No one interrupted. Daniel's face darkened. "You're going to throw me out, just like that. After everything I did for you." Margaret reached into her folder, laid a small voice recorder on the table between them, pressed play. Olivia's voice crackled out, calm, venomous. "We'll lose our chance. Transfer the assets. She won't last much longer." Then Daniel's reply. "She hasn't told me the exact amount, but once it's ours." He lunged forward, slapping the recorder off the table. It clattered across the floor. From the hallway there were gasps. Daniel turned, eyes darting. Faces were staring now, not angry. Worse, ashamed of him, disgusted, appalled. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I carried you for 9 months, she said. "I sat beside your hospital bed when you broke your leg at 10. I sewed your Halloween costumes until 6th grade. I forgave you when you forgot my birthday. I forgave you when you forgot I existed." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "But you," she said, eyes locked on him, "you murdered something far more precious." Daniel swallowed hard. "What?" "You killed my trust." The silence after that was total. It didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a sentence. 2 security guards stepped forward from the reception area. Not hostile, just firm, professional. "Sir," one said, "you'll have to leave." Daniel's eyes flared. "You're siding with her." "No," the man said. "We're protecting her." Daniel looked at his mother one last time. "This isn't over." Margaret didn't move. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." He stormed out. Doors opened and closed. The sunroom fell quiet once more. Margaret sat down slowly, folded her hands in her lap, and for a long moment she simply stared at the hibiscus blooming outside. They'd bloomed late this year, but beautifully all the same. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Margaret Lane walked into the Asheville County Courthouse, head-high, spine, straight folder in hand. The courthouse itself smelled of laminate and old wood, of long waits and hard truths. It didn't intimidate her. She'd once delivered her husband's eulogy in front of 200 people with no microphone. This was nothing. She passed through the metal detector with a nod to the security guard and found her way to the clerk's office. "Good morning," she said to the woman behind the glass. "I'd like to file a formal complaint." "What type of complaint, ma'am?" "Forgery, fraud, asset theft." The clerk blinked. "You have documentation." Margaret placed the folder on the counter. "And recordings." 3 days later, an official investigation was opened against Olivia Lane for suspected document tampering and unauthorized attempts to obtain financial control over an elderly dependent. The key evidence, a scan of a notarized form Olivia had submitted with Margaret's forged signature, attempting to transfer the Belmora Energy stock portfolio into a joint account. The handwriting didn't match, the timestamp didn't match, and the notary, a friend of Olivia's, folded fast when asked about the day the signature was supposedly signed. Things unraveled quickly. Olivia was suspended from her company for violating fiduciary ethics. The firm she worked at, a mid-tier real estate finance outfit, launched a full internal audit. Meanwhile, Daniel Lane's name surfaced in connection with 2 personal loans taken from corporate accounts payments, labeled as consulting expenses but traced directly to his private Venmo. The HR department didn't even wait for the final report. On a rainy Monday morning, Daniel Lane was handed a cardboard box and a release form and was told his services were no longer required. The story was picked up by a local blog that specialized in community scandals. From there, it spread like wildfire. Elderly mother escapes. Financial abuse. Exposes son and daughter-in-law in stunning turnaround. Headlines blared across social media. News vans began circling the golden hearth, hoping for a quote, a glimpse, a photo. But Margaret gave them nothing, not yet. What she did do, however, was sit in a courtroom as a witness. She testified calmly, clearly, with no dramatics. She told them how Olivia had pressured her, how Daniel had remained silent, how their manipulation had been slow, deliberate, calculated. She played the recordings. The prosecutor didn't need much else. Fraud charges were filed. Olivia faced criminal prosecution. Daniel, while not charged, was named as an enabling participant. His professional license was revoked pending investigation. His LinkedIn profile disappeared the next day, and in homes across the city, across the country, conversations began to shift. Mothers called daughters, sons called fathers. Dinner tables became courtrooms of reflection. Are we treating Mom okay? Do we help enough? Have we ever made her feel like a burden? Margaret didn't speak to the media, but the story was no longer hers alone. It became a mirror for thousands. One afternoon, Margaret was called into the director's office at the Golden Hearth. There, a woman in a bright red blazer from the local television network handed her an envelope. "You've been nominated," she said, grinning, "and selected." "For what?" "The Inspiration of the Year Award," the woman said. "Broadcast live next month. You'll be honored for advocacy, elder protection, and community leadership. Congratulations, Miss Lane." Margaret stared at the envelope. "Is this a joke?" "No, ma'am," the woman said, blinking. "It's your legacy." On the night of the award ceremony, Margaret wore a navy blue gown with a small ivory rose pinned to her chest. She was escorted down the red carpet by one of the center's staff members, young, kind, strong. Inside the auditorium, she stood beneath lights that once would have frightened her. Now she felt nothing but clarity. When her name was called, the room rose in applause. She stepped to the podium, adjusted the mic, and spoke. "I was once called a burden, forgotten, hidden. But I am none of those things. What I am is proof that dignity has no expiration date, that justice has no deadline, and that the light we carry, even when others try to dim it, can still build something that outlives the darkness." The standing ovation lasted long after she stepped off stage. And that night, back at the Golden Hearth, a new sign was hung in the hallway outside her office. Bold, simple, carved in brass. "Strength is the voice you reclaim when others try to silence you." M. Lane. In the northern wing of the Golden Hearth, a once empty storage room had been transformed. Where there were once forgotten chairs and dusty bins, now stood easels, brushes, blank canvases, and rows of sketch pads with hand-labeled names in looping cursive. At the front of the room stood Margaret Lane. She wore a linen smock speckled with shades of paint, sunset orange, cobalt blue, olive green, each a story, each a memory. Her hands, once clenched by arthritis, now moved with purpose, not fast, not always steady, but precise. "This week," she said, addressing her class of 15 senior students, "we're painting what we once believed was lost. Silence met her words, not uncomfortable but sacred. One woman, nearly 90, raised her hand. "Do dreams count?" Margaret smiled. "Especially dreams." That was the essence of this program, the one she'd created quietly, humbly, without press or headlines. The Memory Rewritten Project, a series of classes where residents explored forgotten talents, fractured pasts, and what Margaret called the unspoken things. Some wrote poetry, some painted. Others, once deemed too old to learn, were taught to write their name for the very first time. The media had long since moved on, but here Margaret's most enduring work was beginning to bloom. One morning a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered by a social worker from St. Vincent's Orphanage. Tucked in a small envelope, the letter came with a photo, a little girl in a blue hoodie, arms wrapped around a drawing of a house under a star-filled sky. "Dear Ms. Margaret," it read, "thank you for helping me write my story. I found my grandma. Her name is June, and she smells like lemon cookies. She cried when she read my letter. She said she thought she lost me forever, but she didn't. You helped her remember. You helped me find her." The child had once sat in Margaret's lap, sketching crooked flowers and asking how to spell grandma. Her story had begun in that very room, in those very hours. Margaret gave away freely, quietly, changing lives, one pencil stroke at a time. Margaret folded the letter carefully, placed it in the leather-bound journal she kept locked in her desk, and looked out the window with mist in her eyes. Healing didn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it came in the form of a reunion no one thought possible. The following month, a local gallery invited Margaret to display her art. She had laughed when the curator called. "I'm hardly a professional," she said. The woman on the line replied, "That's exactly why it matters." The exhibit was titled Portraits of the Second Sunrise. Each painting came with a handwritten note describing its origin. The centerpiece, placed beneath a soft spotlight in the center of the gallery, drew the most attention. A haunting canvas textured in ash gray and muted amber. It depicted an old woman curled in the corner of a small attic, eyes half lit by a shaft of light from a single dusty window. But her hands held something radiant, a key. And beyond the wall behind her, a hidden garden bloomed. The piece was titled The Mother in the Attic. Crowds stood before it in silence, moved in ways they didn't always have words for. Some cried, others simply stood still. And Margaret, sitting quietly on a bench in the back of the room that evening, watched as strangers found pieces of their own pain inside her portrait. The painting sold for $27,000. She donated every cent to the Golden Hearth's expansion fund. By summer's end, Margaret had added 2 more programs to the center, one for literacy and another for intergenerational mentorship, where older residents were paired with at-risk youth to share skills, stories, and above all, time. "I don't have money," one teen said to his assigned partner, a former high school principal named Carl. Carl patted his shoulder. "You've got minutes. That's the richest currency we've got here." It was what Margaret believed most, that time when given with intention could change everything. Even the past, even yourself. One night, well past closing, Margaret stayed behind in the art room. She was working on a new painting, not for exhibition, not for others, for herself. It was a self-portrait, not of her face, but of her hands, wrinkled, lined, scarred by kitchen work and age, but covered in color, holding a brush, shaping something. She titled it Becoming, because that's what she had done, not simply survived, but transformed. And in doing so reminded the world that some blooms come late, but when they do, they arrive in full color. The early autumn wind carried a kind of stillness across the courtyard of the Golden Hearth. Leaves rustled in lazy circles on the stone path. A distant church bell tolled, echoing faintly in the golden air. It was just past 4 in the afternoon, and Margaret Lane sat alone on a wooden bench by the fountain sketchbook in her lap, pencil unmoving. She hadn't drawn for days. Something in her had stilled, and then she saw him. From the far gate, a man entered the courtyard, thin, slow, like a shadow moving through fog. His jacket was worn, shoes cracked at the soles, hair untrimmed, face sunken. It took her a moment, but she recognized him. Daniel, her son. He didn't look like the man who once barked orders across glass conference tables or carried himself with expensive shoes and entitlement. He looked like someone who had been walking for a very long time and had nowhere else left to go. Margaret didn't rise. She let the moment breathe. He approached hesitantly, eyes flicking to the ground, to her face, then away again. "Hi, Mom." Her fingers tightened slightly around the pencil. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," he added. "I'm always here," she replied quietly. He gave a sad, breathless chuckle. "Yeah, I guess you are." Silence hung between them. It wasn't tense, just worn out, like an old rope too frayed to pull. He cleared his throat. "I've been staying at a friend's place, crashing on couches. Can't get hired anywhere local. Word gets around fast. Especially when you're the guy who tried to steal from his own mother." Margaret said nothing, just watched him. Daniel shifted from foot to foot. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Still she didn't speak. "I know it doesn't fix anything," he continued, voice cracking, "but I need you to hear it. I messed up. I got caught up. Olivia." She pushed hard, but I didn't stop it. I didn't stop myself. And I lost everything. Margaret finally spoke. "You didn't lose everything, Daniel. You gave it away." He flinched like the words themselves struck. "I know," he whispered. There was another long pause. The wind pulled at the pages of her sketchbook. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes darting to hers, "maybe if I could borrow just a little, just to get back on my feet. A few thousand, even just something to help with rent." Margaret blinked slowly. It was the same old song, dressed in a softer key. Her voice was calm, measured, but clear. "I don't hate you," she said. He looked up, startled. "I never hated you," she continued. "I mourned you. I wept for the son I raised. But hatred, that would require too much energy. And I've already spent enough of myself trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." "I do," Daniel said quickly. "I want to change. I just need—" "What you need," she interrupted gently, "is to want more for yourself than what you can take from someone else." He looked like he might cry, but no tears came. "You don't believe I can fix it?" "No," she said. "I believe you can. I just know I'm not the one who can fix it for you." His face crumpled, then collapsing into a mask of despair and realization. He turned his back, staggered a few steps, then paused. "You used to tell me I was brave," he said softly, not looking at her. "You were," she replied. "But bravery doesn't mean charging into a fight. Sometimes it means standing still and facing yourself." He nodded slowly, then walked away. No more words, no threats, no promises, just quiet footsteps fading down the garden path. Margaret watched him go. She didn't cry. She didn't ache. She simply breathed and felt the weight slide from her chest like dust shaken loose from old bones. For the first time in years, she didn't feel responsible for him. She felt light, whole, and free. The string lights in the main hall of the golden hearth twinkled like fireflies caught in twilight. Balloons, simple and pastel, lined the walls, and the scent of cinnamon tea and vanilla cake drifted into every corner. It was Margaret Lane's 73rd birthday. She hadn't asked for a party, but her friends had insisted. They came with flowers tucked into cardigan pockets, old songs hummed under their breath, and smiles that bloomed from places long forgotten. Someone played piano, an old upright barely in tune. Others clapped along. There was laughter, warm and uneven, the kind that carries decades behind it. The kind that knows pain and chooses joy anyway. Margaret sat at the head of the table, not like a queen, but like a lighthouse, constant patient, luminous in quiet ways. She wore a deep blue dress, simple pearl earrings, and a smile that didn't need effort anymore. Her hair was pinned up, a silver crown woven from survival and choice. As the final notes of Happy Birthday faded, one of the staff members, Emily, barely 25, but old in soul, approached the front holding something wrapped in white cloth. "We have a gift," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "From all of us. From everyone you've touched." She gently unwrapped the cloth, revealing a hand-painted portrait. Gasps rippled across the room. It was Margaret sitting in her usual chair by the sunroom window, light pouring behind her like a halo. But it wasn't just her likeness. It was layered. Around her subtle shapes, ghost-like silhouettes reached toward her elderly hands, orphaned children, invisible lives, all drawn into her gravity. At the bottom, in soft cursive gold, read the words, "The Mother of the Forgotten." For a long time, Margaret said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out and touched the frame. Then she whispered, "You remembered me before I even remembered myself." The room stood in silence. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they didn't want to interrupt the moment truth arrived. Margaret stood slowly and turned to her community. I once thought being a mother meant giving until there was nothing left, she said. But I've learned that love isn't about losing yourself. It's about returning to who you were always meant to be. She smiled. And today I am home. Later that night, when the hall had emptied and the stars blinked quietly above the courtyard, Margaret returned to her favorite place, the window seat in her study. The portrait sat beside her, the cake knife still on the table untouched. She opened her leather-bound journal, the one she'd begun nearly a year ago on the day she left her old life behind. And in a slow, deliberate hand she wrote, "They say it takes a lifetime to sacrifice yourself for others, but sometimes you must sacrifice the old story to finally become yourself. I was a wife, a mother, a forgotten woman in an attic. But now, I am a beginning." She closed the journal. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees like a lullaby. And inside, Margaret Lane exhaled, not in pain, not in weariness, but in freedom. For the first time in her life, the chapter was hers, written on her own terms, and it ended not with grief, but with peace.